All right, can you hear us? Can I increase that? Right. Hello, Kayode. Can you hear us? You said okay. I spoke with Adela. She says you'll be testing the lighting as well. So can you turn on your mic and unmute yourself so we can hear you as well?
Okay, I just unmuted myself.
Okay, we can hear you all here. Can you turn on your mic?
Yeah, my mic is on. Okay, the video, it says I cannot start video because the host has stopped it.
Let me see if there's. Okay, could you try now?
Okay. Yes, okay. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. You can hear us fine?
What do you say?
I said you can hear us fine?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yes.
Okay. You can confirm this is the exact spot the minister will be having the commissioner will be having the dialogue from?
No, I did not get that.
I said, can you confirm that this is the exact spot the commissioner would be participating in the dialogue from?
Yes, it's this exact spot. Yes, this chair. Yes.
Thank you very much for your testing. See you by 5:30.
I'd like to ask that everyone please put your phones on silent and leave our questions on hold until after the discussion. Thank you very much, Boone, and our guests for joining us today. Over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both those here physically as well as those joining us virtually. Welcome to the 67th Power Dialogue. Tonight's event is titled Towards a Decentralized Electricity Market, the Lagos State Electricity Policy. I think you all agree with me that even though it's been a few years since privatization, there's still inadequate power supply, and it affects most of us Nigerians, or all of us Nigerians. The amount of power on the grid has pretty much stagnated. The data tells us that only about 57% of the population is served, and even then, we are underserved. While the installed grid has a willing capacity of about 8 gigawatts, on a day-to-day basis, we are probably only willing about 4 to 4.5 gigawatts. Now, this deficit is actually even more pronounced in Lagos, given that Lagos is the country's economic capital. And according to data from the Lagos State Electricity Board, 15 gigawatts of power is provided from off-grid fuel generation sources, as the national grid only meets about 10% or less than 10% of Lagos State's demand. So obviously, some experts have suggested that decentralization is perhaps the way to go, and have suggested that splitting the grid into smaller units would allow increased investment into the electricity market. And it is in this vein that last year, the Lagos State government moved to establish a state electricity market. The state unveiled its Lagos State Electricity Policy, and this policy sets out to develop a Lagos State electricity market. It has short, medium, and long-term goals, and intends to delineate its market by the end of 2022. So with that as context, the specific objectives of tonight's dialogue are to assess the possibilities and benefits of a decentralized electricity market, to highlight the features of the Lagos State Electricity Policy, to analyze the framework of the Lagos electricity market, and to also identify the regulatory or the possible regulatory and legal challenges that may impede the implementation of the Lagos electricity market. So the format of tonight's event is that the panelists will provide us with a brief 5 to 7 minutes introduction, as well as opening remarks. We will then have about 30 to 40 minutes of a moderated session in which I'll ask the panelists questions. We'll then open it up for audience participation, both those with us physically here, as well as those virtually. And then we'll conclude with about 5 to 6 minutes of closing remarks and closing comments. So with that, I would like to invite the panelists. So I'd like to introduce the panelists and then invite them for their opening remarks. First of all, I'd like to introduce Mr. Olalere Odusote, the Honorable Commissioner, Energy and Natural Resources, Lagos State, as well as Mr. Chubuke Onwuzurumba, who is a partner at Oak Legal. So I think with the protocols established and set, may I invite the Honorable Commissioner to introduce himself, as well as to provide 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks. Mr. Odusote.
Good evening, everyone. If you can hear me, Bumi, can you just raise your hand up? Oh, my name is, as he has mentioned, Olalere Odusote, the Honorable Commissioner, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Lagos State. He has created the background already, and everybody now understands that we don't have steady, reliable power supply in Nigeria. And he's also highlighted that the problem is felt more in Lagos State than anywhere else. And talked about the studies that we've done that have shown that Lagos State is more off-grid than on-grid, given that more than 80% of the power that's supplied in Lagos at any point in time is from off-grid generation, with the grid itself providing a small part of this. When I've had discussions many times with some of the management of the DisCos in Lagos, and Lagos is unique in that it has 2 DisCos that are largely dedicated to just supplying Lagos State. They've expressed frustrations also at the allocation of power from the federal government and the inability of the inabilities of the DisCos to get more power. They're unable to collect what they need to collect because they're not getting the support that they need to be able to improve their collections and be able to satisfy the needs of the center for payment for the electricities that they do receive. They've also complained at several times that the electricity that's supplied to them is supplied in areas that they would have preferred to not be prioritized, or to be deprioritized, if you will, such that they're able to fulfill their commercial requirements as well. Because any power that's supplied to the distribution companies have to be paid for, which is expected. But the distribution companies also expect to be able to run their organizations in a way that is profitable, given that they have requirements of them to be able to play. So what we've looked at is not that Lagos wants to create its energy market just because it wants to stand alone. It wants to create an energy market because it believes it will be more efficient to do it that way. The management of the entire electricity sector from Abuja for the past 70 years has not provided the results that we expected that they would provide. And so we're saying, let's get closer to the customers with regulation. So that means let's first of all take the regulation away from the center. Let's look at what Lagos's unique problems are, and let's try and solve them from Lagos State. And that's why we're talking about a unique energy market for Lagos. Now, we haven't just come out and said we want to create a Lagos energy market. We've done an integrated energy resource plan. We've identified where the power is needed in Lagos. We've identified how we can get power to Lagos. We've identified what the infrastructure gaps are, both at the distribution level, at the transmission level, and also at the generation level. We've also done studies to determine where the fuels would come from and generation mix we should have in Lagos, such that by 2036, as we have universal electricity supplies in Lagos. Now, we have to be realistic because there is a timeline to investment. We've decided where the injection points are likely to be, but reinforcing the distribution system as we have it to be able to supply the load centers that we have identified in Lagos. So we've done a lot. We've looked at the IRP, and what we've said we're going to be doing as a next step is to ensure that the regulatory framework that supports our aspirations are then put in place. Meaning we've now published a policy as of last year that everyone has seen and has had time to go through and has had time to provide feedback on. Now, let me step back a bit more and say that even before we published that policy, we went through a consultation process. We shared our plans with pretty much everybody in the sector, and they had a year and a half to have engagement with us to look at what we had put out as our policy plans and provide input into it. We had all of the distribution companies, all of the government agencies read that and get back to us as to what they think would be the right way to go. We also consulted with regulatory experts to determine whether or not Lagos State was able to, under the Constitution, carry on these responsibilities. And the feedback we got was what went into the publication of the policy. Now that that's done, what we're doing is coming up with a law that's going to give teeth to the policy. And the expectations that we create institutions that are required by such a law to enable proper regulation of electricity in Lagos. And we think that in little steps at the time, we're going to start to get it right. We're going to see better supply of electricity because we're going to see more supportive regulation from Lagos that's going to enable the growth of the sector. Enable the growth of the sector means simply being able to attract significant investment into the sector by providing some certainty of regulation and also investor-friendly policies and regulation that will enable the growth of the sector. To you.
Sorry, were you done?
Can you hear me?
You're back now.
Oh, okay. I'm guessing you lost me. I'm not sure where
We
you
lost you
me.
for about 20 seconds.
Oh dear. So what I said was we've gone through a process to come up with this policy, and the next steps would be to pass the law. And we expect that we then will be able to attract the investment, and that's what we want when we talk about investor-friendly regulations that we're going to be coming up with. We're going to be coming up with a certain regulator that will have the mandate to provide investor-friendly regulations. I think that's when I handed over to you, but you lost me by then.
Okay. Thank you for those opening remarks. And I'll now ask Chubike to offer his opening remarks as well as a brief introduction.
Right, hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chubike Oluzumban Neto. I'm a lawyer and practicing in this industry. So first of all, I think it's a good thing that we have this platform to discuss this very topical issue. It couldn't have come at a better time with the recent even power supply issues we've had in the market, coupled with what the National Assembly has done in passing Bill 33 to essentially expand the powers of states to make laws on the sector. Everyone also is very familiar with what Lagos State is trying to do with their policy. And I mean, if any state was ever going to pioneer that process, yeah, I don't think it's a surprise that it is Lagos State. They have been very proactive with these kinds of issues on several other sectors, and this is not a surprise. And I know that the debate on the Lagos policy has mostly focused on the legal constitutional issues, and that is important because investors are not going to put money in any opportunity that has a quote-unquote uncertain legal standing. So on one hand, it is a good thing that the process of resolving those legal and constitutional issues have started with the constitutional amendment process that is ongoing at the National Assembly. But on the other hand, beyond the legal and constitutional issues, I think there are also some equally or perhaps more important technical and commercial issues that should go into the concept of decentralizing the electricity market generally. So on the technical side, really, it's important to understand that the electricity industry is primarily a wires business. The experts haven't figured out how to move electricity wirelessly. So with every piece of electricity you've got to get to the market, there's got to be a wire for it. It's heavily dependent on physical infrastructure. And as a general principle, the idea of having all of these wires and related infrastructure crisscrossing a relatively compact land space is not ideal. So there is a reason why there is some level of centralization in the setup. There is some level of monopoly in the setup that is understandable. However, those technical issues are not insurmountable, but it's important to think clearly how those are going to be resolved. I mean, we are mostly, I'm sure, familiar with the 2021. We were just talking about it before this, of 2021 Texas energy crisis, where they suffered outages for a number of days that led to several complications and some deaths. That has partly been done. Texas is essentially an islanded electricity market disconnected from the major national grids in the United States. And so even though states that experienced the winter storm crisis, they were the one that suffered the most to import electricity into their state. So those potential technical issues are what should be considered in this concept of decentralizing the market. And by that, I mean the policy, for instance, of Lagos State are presently designed, which suggests something of an islanded power market. On the commercial side, obviously, there's got to be some thinking about what the impact of a decentralized market will have on pricing and ability to attract investment, particularly private financing, into the sector. The reason why you've got a network is, I mean, you tend to spread the costs and make it a bit more efficient for the consumer to be able to buy electricity. And obviously, the smaller the market, the more potential you have for higher costs and higher prices ultimately being passed on to the consumer. So, in my view, it is, and it's a welcome idea really to think of breaking up the market a little bit, but I think there needs to be a bit more thought on exactly what profile that decentralization has to take. I am not fully convinced that approaching it from a devolution of powers perspective is necessarily the solution. And it's important for us to understand that what's going on with the constitutional amendment process is actually a devolution of powers issue. It's not necessarily a decentralization of the markets issue. So essentially, you've got the National Assembly saying to the states, now you've got a bit more power to make laws in the industry, not necessarily to generate, transmit, and distribute, no, but to make laws in the industry. So taking it from that perspective of a division of powers, to me, is not really the answer to it. Now, are you able to achieve decentralization without necessarily carving up regulatory and legislative powers? I think yes. And I think there may be sufficient legal and regulatory framework today to have Lagos State do what they intend to do without necessarily islanding itself within the national market, essentially creating a subnational market. So in the end, I think it is a good thing that Lagos is forcing this conversation, but I think it's also important that now that those legal constitutional issues are partly being addressed, that we try to now pay attention to some of the potential technical and commercial issues that has got to come with this, right? Where are they going to get their generation from, for instance? How much control will the sources of those generations have? What if those generators are in other states, for instance? What are they going to do if those states decide to also go away from the market? How long will it take from now, given the timelines that they've put in the policy, to get the generation capacity that they need to build the low voltage transmission network that they've designed to create their independent system operator, and all of those issues? How are you going to deal with pricing and cost? How are you going to give investors the assurance that they are not going to have their investments stranded in some legal and constitutional crisis? And those are all the questions that I think we should now start to pay more attention to. So in conclusion, I would say that yes, there is some promise in the idea of a decentralized electricity market, but we need to be sure that what we are doing is not just a devolution of powers thing, but actually looking at perhaps breaking up, like Bumi had said, the assets in the industry into perhaps chewable bits, and not necessarily from a geographic state perspective. It's a political solution, but ultimately trying to have an industry that is still networked, but able to avoid situations where one part of the network crashes the entire network. And I think the trend may be towards more connection rather than disconnection, which is one risk that a decentralized market might bring. I mean, you've got what's going on with the West African power pool, which if the trade agreement goes on, may end up as an African pool, really. And what you've got going on in North America and the rest of them. So I think an increased network is still
a good idea, but creating efficiencies that avoids the pitfalls that we have currently in Nigeria, where over centralization means that one problem in one part of the network crashes the rest. So hopefully today's dialogue will throw some more light on these issues, and we can hopefully find some solutions. Thank you.
So thank you both. I think you have both given us a lot to chew on and have basically set us up to address many of the issues that have been brought forward. But I think first back to the Honorable Commissioner. So Tripike attempted to define or characterize what he understands to be a decentralized electricity market. But since we're specifically speaking about the case in Lagos, can I have you basically give us the key features of decentralization as Lagos State is envisioning it?
Thank you. Justice to that question, I'd have to perhaps go back a bit and let us understand how we arrived at where we are. Right, we've talked about it, we've talked about the fact that it's not working, but perhaps if I give you the specific number of bad it is. So Lagos State currently gets an average of 800 megawatt. It is Nigeria's most industrialized region. And that means we're getting 30 watts per person for a population of 26 million. Let us compare this to South Africa, where the whole country gets 410 watts per person. And we're not picking out the industrialized area of South Africa in the country as a whole. If we already then say that we already have entered off grid supply in Lagos, mostly diesel generators, right, that's applying power to Lagosians, then you understand that there is already a solution, a centralized solution already exists that is not formal and is therefore suboptimal. And that solution is the one that we need to formalize and optimize. Right? Now, when the federal government reform started in 2000, it was focused on instituting a single national market. The power policy came out in 2001. The law was passed in 2005. The unbundling PHC and establishment of NREA. Now, the verification letter for the state. But at that time, electricity responsibilities whatsoever, given that every single agency that was in the electricity sector at that time was federal. Now, post-privatization, we had an insolvent single buy market with no cash flow for maintenance and capex improvement, and a for sucking up public funds. Now, because of the availability of that public fund, those results over the past 21 years, right, and have been suboptimal, and our power supply has not improved at all. We need to, again, execute our own integrated resource Lagos better at planning infrastructure from Lagos than the federal government is a pioneering role in power in Nigeria. The Enron transaction, right? We were the first state to attempt to break the monopoly of the which we would have said was at the peak of its abysmal performance at that time. I mean, that project failed due to a breach of the agreement, again by the federal government. Lagos has built its own IPPs to supply its own infrastructure. Lagos has deployed street lights across all of Lagos, and Lagos has injected over 1,000 transformers to Lagos State network. Some of those transformers till today have not been energized because, again, Lagos is looking at where it wants to improve power, and it's not necessarily along the lines of what the federal government wants to do. What we've said is we need to create an electricity framework. And to the question of what we're able to do, the Constitution, just like you said, was clear that we were able to do this anyway without any any need to change the constitution or without any clarification being made by the National Assembly. Now, the clarification that was made by the National Assembly last week was really just a signal to everyone ready and we're ripe for a decentralized network. What is a decentralized network? It's one that's not based of the power that's generated, right? And then ensure that due to the tariff structure of the system, that generation will never be adequate to serve Lagos, even though you say it's a certain percentage. While that might work for the rest of the states in the country, the commercial nerve center of Nigeria needs better planning than that. And what we've said is we need 7 factors: an enabling constitutional and legal framework, an integrated regulatory body, a competent and transparent procurement of generation, bankable. Now think about that. Bankable commercial framework is what we're good at doing in Lagos, but it's also not what the federal government is good at doing. They're good at saying it, but they're not good at doing it. And we've seen it time and time again. The federal government has a penchant for price regulation, right? For price controls that we don't necessarily have. And those price controls are what have resulted in the price of fuel and the smuggling that's going on. We don't want the same thing with electricity, especially not in Lagos. We've set a funded and well-managed generation, transmission, and distribution sector. And we also need the collaboration of the federal government. We've said that very clearly. The system of the an off-grid agency, which we're allowed to do by the constitution system, and a policy setting body of the state government. So it's not that we're saying we have to separate Lagos completely. I'm saying that the regulations will be different. Just as we have price differentiation amongst all of the distribution companies, we're going to have a price differentiation in Lagos. We're going to look at Lagos, we're going to determine what the returns on that infrastructure investment should be, and we're going to be setting tariffs that are clear and transparent, such that we can ensure the safety of the sector. Now, let me also explain something else that you know already, but you may not have thought about in detail. In the past, according to our records, the Lagos market has acquired 8,000 megawatts of diesel distribution capacity. Now, anybody who has a diesel generator in his house knows that you have to pay cash for that diesel generator. So 8,000 megawatts of diesel generators bought in Lagos in the past 3 years and paid for by the market. Now compare that to the national grid that has only been able to enter into a 450 megawatt transaction over the past 7 years. A subsidy from the federal government into the sector to enable it to happen. Lagos does not have a mature electricity market. Essential estates. It is, and we're going the megawatt installation to say that they want to dedicate it to that state. They can't do that because that company won't make money. So we'll be able to trace, because they will be able to regulate the trades across country boundaries. So I don't really see a problem with Lagos State creating its market and still being able to trade in Lagos. And we're doing a lot of studies to see what it is we can do. We did a study last year to determine what the generation potential be able to supply centrally into the grid. So that already exists, and those are things we're looking at. So it's not to say that Lagos is trying to take itself away from the market. No, Lagos is trying to create audacious solutions to solve its own problems. We are not able to sit down and wait to line up behind what the regulation at the federal government level is and hope that it supports our progress as a state. I hope I've addressed the issues that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So back to Chibuike, you've heard from the Honorable Commissioner, his perspective on what a deregulated or decentralized market, electricity market is. So wherein do you, based on the way the Honorable Commissioner described the decentralized markets, do you see potential conflicts arising? Perhaps it's the fact that the national and the state markets are at different stages in the market. Perhaps you see a misalignment between a state ISO and a federal ISO. Perhaps there are other market inconsistencies that you see, but would you like to expand on some of the areas where you think you see conflicts?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, the point is taken that if any state is able to do this, it's Lagos. And the issues that the Honorable Commissioner has mentioned about Lagos being the commercial nerve center of Nigeria and it's the need really being relatively more important for Lagos State than perhaps other parts of Nigeria, that point is taken. Now, the thing though is when we say you want to create an independent system operator, it's difficult to see how that works if you are still somehow interconnected with the national market. There's got to be some form of central dispatch for that system to be efficient. And when it's mentioned that long-term, the plan is to build enough generation capacity in Lagos State to be able to essentially trade within Lagos State. Now, that's fair. And I mean, how long that will take is another question. My point is that the concept of decentralized markets is a good one. Now, I will imagine perhaps having some regional, some breakup, if you like, of TCN more on a regional basis rather than states. Because what you then have is, again, I mentioned that Lagos is relatively a compact land space, even though a lot of demand and consumption is concentrated in the states, and that's true. But if you've got other states going the route of Lagos without having perhaps some of the profile commercially, politically, financially that Lagos has, they are going to crash. So it's not to say the idea of decentralization is not, it's a welcome thing at this stage, but having it at that state level needs a bit more thought. I think technically it will have to be a bit more refined. Having an independent system operator in Lagos State it's going to inevitably conflict with what you've got with any other system operator anyway, particularly if the generation capacity at this moment and in the short to medium term is not going to be in Lagos State. It's difficult to see how that works. I've noted that the policy mentions building and designing low voltage transmission networks, 33 kV to 132 at the moment. The truth is that as the legal regulatory framework is right now in Nigeria today, with what you've got with the independent electricity distribution network regulations, with what you've got with the investment in electricity networks regulations, there is, I think, enough basis to start to have that decentralized market without the constitutional overhaul that seems to be what everyone is focused on right now. And the commissioner mentioned that Lagos is only looking to formalize what it has been doing over the past few years anyway, and that's true. That's true. Lagos, he's mentioned the Barge project. Lagos has done a lot to take away a lot of their facilities and institutions, state-owned institutions, a lot of their public services, the street lightnings and all of that, and the medical health institutions. They've managed to take them off the grid and have some self-sufficiency in their power solution, and it's been working. A lot of them are enjoying 24-hour power supply And that's correct. Now, moving that setup now to the wider population with private consumers, with residential consumers, those are where I think some of those price inefficiencies are going to then come in, and where are also then going to have some of the technical bottlenecks in having wires crisscrossing each other. Now, there are technologies to deal with that. There's underground, there's subsea level wiring and all of that, and that's fine. But decentralization at the state level, I would say we need to think again about that. At the regional level, perhaps, and that's fine. And Lagos is in a position where it can very, very efficiently coordinate a lot of the states around it. You've got a lot of Lagos businesses living in the suburbs in other states, working in Lagos, or the other way around. So, I mean, you've got what's going on in and all of those. So those are the inefficiencies. So it's not necessarily a question of conflict for me. It's more a question of inefficiencies in the system that I think can be better addressed.
Thank you. I think that's well understood. And if I could infer or read in between the lines, my next question to the Honorable Commissioner will be, you did say it's a policy. You did say that the state intends to enact a law. Obviously, the policy does set out what is to be done in the short, medium, and longer term. You may challenge me if I characterize it as aggressive, but I guess my question to you is, given the timelines in the policy, do you believe Lagos State can meet those timelines? And what are the impediments, would I say, from the national or the sovereign regulation standpoint that may impede your ability to hit what I'm characterizing as your aggressive timelines?
Thank you, Bumi. This administration, there was a lukewarm reception from the center. Everyone had been doing the same thing for so long. That for we did. So that's where we started from. We started to have those discussions. Started to think along the same direction. Now, when the mention of constitutional overhaul came up, as we clarify that, the Constitution was always clear that electricity was an area of concurrent legislation. It was always clear, it's on the concurrent list. In fact, when you look at the specific in the Constitution, it said government, it said generation, transmission, and distribution. So it was always clear that distribution area was left, or electricity retail, if you will, was an area that the Constitution felt should have been the responsibility alone. That's what you mentioned when it comes to the state government. And we're clear what distribution is. There's no argument about what is generation. The only argument is what constitutes national grid and what does not. And for everybody who's been talking about it, detailed distribution and what the state needs. It was just a question of the law says this. The law is maybe in conflict, perhaps in drafting the law, this was what the intention was. it was clear to us, I mean, the law overreached. It assigned responsibilities that did not belong to the federal government, to federal government agencies. And we've never had a problem stating that. Now, as of this year, they had come a full circle. The NERC discussions were to the effect of, that's what the Constitution asked for a brain trust in regulation today anyway. Most of it is to be found in NERC because that's really the only place where we've been doing regulation forever. And so the collaboration intention is already there. I've already started engaging with them and they're very happy to collaborate with us on that. So I don't really with it to give effect to this story. With speech that was made by the budget speech that of Assembly Lagos State come to the table and understand exactly what responsibilities we're going to be taking. The point of funding, right? I mentioned earlier when I spoke that the Lagos market had acquired 8,000 megawatts of distribution of diesel generation capacity over the past 3 years. The federal government has only, the market is already paying for electricity today. So trying to devise means of subsidizing the sector is really just trying to devise means of creating inefficiency in the sector. The sector can run efficiently today without a subsidy, and it's already doing that, meaning the power that you're not is being provided by more expensive private generation. I had a discussion, one of the discussions we had with NERC was to look at the largest licensed off-grid generators in Ikeja today in Lagos. And to say, if you take the 10 largest generators of power, off-grid power in Ikeja, they can provide all of the need of Ikeja today. So we already have passed in the system that's suboptimal, meaning they have redundancies that they don't need, significant levels of redundancies that they don't need, that if we were to commercialize, to sell power to the grid for far cheaper than people are able to attract them today. So that's not the only ask now that show that Lagos can actually be sufficient on renewables if we can find a way to aggregate the demand and be able to serve it. So, and I'm not worried about that. Once we identify the problems, and we live in interesting times, it's just to find audacious solutions to it, and Lagos been shy to deploy audacious solutions to solving our own problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Commissioner. So to Chubike, the Honorable Commissioner is basically saying Lagos is almost there, right? And in terms of, and I'm the one using this word, there are probably bankable transactions today in that market, and financing or funding is probably not an issue. So my question to you is, given the wider picture nationally, and also focusing in on Lagos State, do you concede, and if you don't, explain why, that in Lagos and perhaps in a few other states, they can get to contract-based power transactions quickly?
So, first of all, I know that what Lagos is trying to do is obviously the intention is great. And I keep making the point that the issue for me is not in conflict, but more in efficiencies. Now, specifically to your point about it being contract-based, by default, I think that the less governments you have in some of these transactions, the better. So if what Lagos is saying is that somehow it is going to bring some form of sovereign activity on the ability of a consumer and a utility to contract, then I will be concerned that the same inefficiencies you've had at the national level could ultimately transmit even at that subnational level. So that, to my mind, the right approach is not for governments to be necessarily part of contracting, but to enable policies that allow private investors to come to and invest in the infrastructure required to meet the needs of consumers and allow them as private entities to contract, which I know is already happening. It is already happening. So what you've got with, and I think somewhere down the line, we're going to talk about the traditional electricity market where we're supposed to have more contract-based transactions. It's coming down. My concern is that a lot of people are excited because of the really desperate situations we have now by the idea of states just taking it over, states take over, states take over. And I'm saying that is merely a devolution of power issue. I don't think it is necessarily going to solve the problem that we're going to have in the sector. So it's not a question of states taking over. I mean, then what are the states going to do? I mean, in terms of actual contracting, what are they going to provide generators with some guarantees as to their payment? Or are they going to tell consumers that, hey, we are going to somehow subsidize or have all of that? So what exactly will be the role of the states in all of those contracting? So I'm not convinced that the approach of states, more government involvement in contracting is necessarily it. I'm saying that, and Lagos is very well placed to do this, and I know they are doing it already. Build policies that makes it possible for a private financier to say, this is a good place to put my money long term, because I know that the factors that will enable me to recover my investments are there. To have the state at any level, federal, state, or any other subnational level, to have the state continue to play active roles in the actual implementation of these market activities is still a concern to me. And this is, I'm saying this without prejudice really to what the Honorable Commissioner has said about Lagos really being run more efficiently than most states. It's a point that I fully concede. But I'm saying that particularly now that you find Lagos expanding in terms of industrialization, a lot of them are not necessarily in Lagos anymore, but their workers live in Lagos, they're committing, they've got their raw materials coming from Lagos, they've got their investors in Lagos. I mean, Lagos is where all the financial institutions are. Right, but the actual production and the actual consumption of the energy is not necessarily in Lagos. So let's have this idea of decentralization be slightly wider than the concept of a state. That's the point. Now, when the Honorable Commissioner says, for instance, that there's no big deal about a constitutional overhaul, my opinion on that is a little nuanced, right? The Nigerian constitution as it is today, I've read the arguments of the states about the schedule, the concurrent list saying that the states can make laws. Section 14, I believe, deals with the states. You can make laws on electricity transmission, generation, distribution, and all that. But the entire idea of the concurrent list is that states can make laws where the federal laws have not already covered that subject. Where you have a law that has already covered the subject, even if you've got that item on the concurrent list, it is technically questionable on legal grounds for a state to still go on there. So I wouldn't say that there's really no big deal with the constitutional overhaul. There is some deal there, and I'm sure it is something that investors are looking at on what legal basis do we have this. So the mere fact that it is already in the concurrent list does not mean states can just go on and make the laws. They're still got to be sure that those laws have not already been covered at the federal level. And I think that point has to be clearly made. Now, you've got a very clear idea in Lagos State that is still going to be impacted by the political process at the federal level. So the National Assembly has passed the law now. It's going to get transmitted to the states for their own assent. It's going to come back to the president for his own assent, and no one can be entirely sure how that process is going to go. There was that controversy about whether or not the president needs to approve a constitutional amendment. Some people say you should because it's an act of the National Assembly. Others say it is not because it has been passed by a 2/3 majority. Personally, I think the president doesn't need to pass it. As long as the National Assembly and the states have passed it, it should become law. But those are all processes that are still pending on this issue. And inevitably, there are going to be political considerations and geopolitical considerations that will come into play in all of this. So I would say that that shouldn't also be swept off the table by the Lagos state government. But again, and to be clear, the question of contracting, I am not convinced that states in an increased state activity at any level on contracting is necessarily a good thing. It doesn't solve the problems that we have.
Okay, so thank you. And I hear you on inefficiencies, and I want you to be a little bit more precise on whether you're talking more about the economic and commercial / market inefficiencies. I think that's really what you're speaking to. So play out a scenario, right? Lagos State is willing to enter into willing buyer, willing seller contracting for power, right? Does this cannibalize the systems in other states? As an example, what autonomy do some of these other states have that Lagos State may be attempting to import power from? How do you see that working when you potentially have, 36 or 36 plus 1 different systems trying to operate in tandem, one with the other?
Right. So going with the scenario you pointed, for instance, we have, say, a consumer in Lagos State wants to buy say 2 megawatts of power. And currently, the way the market is structured already, there are eligible customers that are able to do that willing buyer, willing seller. We know all of the problems there are with NEC on those issues, and that's fine. Now, as it is, a lot of, for instance, technical considerations are going to come in. At what voltage is that customer going to get that power? Are they able to take it at 33 kV, for instance, or are they going to have it still drop down to 11? And all of those, at what price are they going to have that power delivered to them? There are several players in the chain that gets the power ultimately to the consumer, right? You've got the generator, you've got the gas supplier, in fact, you've got the generator, you've got the transmission, and then the distribution. Now, taking all of those into consideration, there's a weighted average approach to tariffs nationally, and any consumer or a large consumer taking up a market does impact on what the other consumers are having to pay for their power, right? And that is one commercial area where if you yank off Lagos State of the market, could have that effect on the weighted average nationally, right? It could also impact even the Lagos consumers. On the technical side, you are going to have to deal with issues of rights of way. You're going to have to deal with issues of wires having to, there are health and safety considerations to all of those. Now, I'm saying that those are the things that need to be thought about. We've got a national grid currently, which everyone knows is not operating optimally. There is a path to having more optimal solutions to what the national grid is having. There are sufficient legal regulatory framework currently to enable whether private or state actors to try to invest in those constraints and solve them. They are there right now. And that, to me, should be what the focus of a decentralized market should be. Getting private or state actors work at attracting investments in dealing with those rather than having just a devolution of power achievement. So again, the scenario being played out, I'm saying one, that yank off, if you like, is going to impact what other consumers are going to be paying across the market. It's also going to essentially impact what the consumer in Lagos itself is going to pay. And to the commissioner's point about consumers in Lagos particularly being able to pay or being willing to pay slightly more for reliability, that's true. And I'm not sure I don't think that's true just for Lagos. I think that's true everywhere, really. People will happily pay more if they are convinced about reliability. But I'm saying again, let's work out an approach that takes, we break up the national setup, but in a slightly larger size than just the states. As far as confident as Lagos State is about its self-sufficiency, I still think there's still a lot of interrelationship between it and its neighboring states and the region. Generally, that means it's got to perhaps expand that policy a little bit more.
Thank you. So, Honorable Commissioner, I want to ask you basically the same question to play out the scenario. You potentially have 36 states which have their own markets. You have considered that Lagos State would be interconnected to, contract for generation, to contract for power. So does this basically become an issue where it's about chasing price, and whomever can pay more will end up getting the power? I know your concentration is on Lagos, but we have, we work in a constrained market. Lagos State could take all the available power today if it could be transported to Lagos. But in this environment of having devolution, how do you see that playing out, and who does it benefit? And do you perhaps see some of these inefficiencies, which I think we're characterizing as economic or commercial inefficiencies, also plaguing the market?
Right, thank you. At a few different ways. When I was speaking earlier, I was very clear that the Lagos market does not need a subsidy. Need a subsidy, it's very clear. Lagos market is already paying for electricity today that it's using, whether it's from the grid or from off-grid generation. I also said that more than 80% of the power that's brought today is off-grid, is coming from off-grid sources, with only 20% being supplied by the grid. So the expectation, the inefficiencies that exist in the system due to the disparate off-grid solutions that everybody has, and ensuring that we can optimize it, we will still be trading. And a lot of people miss to build it. So the distribution will be regulated in a way that allows them to move power from A to B in a more efficient manner. I also explained subsidies were end up not subsidized, but subsidizing private pockets, as well as people who don't belong in that population. So if I start to subsidize electricity supply in Lagos, how quickly will they start smuggling electricity from Lagos to neighboring states where they can pay much higher for them? You will see all of those things happening in very creative ways. So that's why I'm saying, let's first of all, think about the market as a market that can serve itself, and not a market that requires subsidies. It does not. Now, to the question again about this. The superiority of it, the assemblies are not expected to make those laws. But in a situation where the federal government makes laws that it is not empowered to make, as has been argued in many cases and won before, then you can reverse that law. So if the federal government makes a law on distribution where the Constitution says it cannot make laws on distribution and only the state governments are, we're not expected to keep behind them and say, okay, well, only the federal government can make these laws. They will repeal known laws and then we go to make that argument as to which one should be superior, I would have no problems having those debates. And we've had serious, again, if you look back at my first statement, we spent a year and a half, right? We had shared our consultation papers on what the policy was going to achieve, and we discussed with a lot of lawyers. In fact, more lawyers responded than industry players. We had banks respond, we had lawyers respond, we had financiers respond, and we had even the government agencies as well as the existing players to respond. So all of those have already been taken into consideration, and we understand what the risk. And so far, what we see, right? What we see is a very clear way where we're saying that the petrol price regulation is what we're trying to get out of. If somebody decides that we're going to fix a price and the price has no bearing on reality, then it creates a problem for the sector, because on a monthly basis, you then have to provide a subsidy now. The minute you start to provide a subsidy, all you're doing is funding an inefficiency, because it will get more and more and more inefficient, because you're then not placing any burden on any of the market players to be efficient. That's really all I'm saying. And Lagos is clear that we want to get rid of that. We want a market that is and increasingly efficient, meaning we expect the efficiencies to go up year on year. It's not like where we have today, where the federal government has roles to play, and where it does not play its own role in the market, it then subsidizes the market for not being able to live up to its own responsibilities. The longer that stays, the more difficult it is for you to reverse that. And that's why I'm saying that Lagos State wants to, and see where, if all the states decide to come up with their own regulatory agencies, we think it's a welcome development. It's very good, because then you can compare the markets, and then you can sit down and determine where you plan your investments, if you will, because you then have an opportunity to evaluate them. What it does is it makes everybody sit on their, it makes everybody stand on their toes and the market. And one of the things that I keep saying, that the best way to support a market is by providing a clear regulatory framework that helps everybody see where they can play, right? What the opportunities are and what the requirements are of them, rather than a system that's unclear, where people then start to play arbitrages off each other, which is what's happening today. The federal government is being played. The federal government is the biggest loser in the system today. So if the federal government is the one paying all of these subsidies, if it's the one carrying all of those, if there's one providing all of these guarantees, at some point it's going to break. And it's starting to happen. We're starting to see it. We're having grid collapses all over the place. And it's simply because we cannot regulate the market. We're simply unable to. And the penalties for or for non-performance, nobody has to comply with them. It's the same as in the oil industry. We're flaring gas today, even though it's because the penalties are not severe enough to want to make you stop flaring. So it's exactly the same thing. You're going to put power at a frequency that the national grid. They have no problems. That's really to say that it's not a market that's going to be inefficient. It's a market that's going to wait and where's the efficiency over time. And that's really what the case is. It's not about conflict. It's not about, it's really just about serving the market the best way we can.
Thank you.
Bumi, just 1 second, and not to take, there's a quick point I would like to make here, right? It just came to me while the Honorable Commissioner was speaking about it being a good thing for all the states to decide to make their own regulations on the market. Now, and this is the point I'm hoping I will eventually convey very clearly, right? What the industry, so my vision of a decentralized electricity market is not more regulation. I in fact think that more regulation will be a problem. My idea of a decentralized market will be more competition. So you've got more actors, not necessarily state actors, more market participants competing with their peers, driving up value for the consumer in terms of the quality of their services and in terms of the pricing that they offer. I'm concerned that the popular idea of a decentralized market is a devolution of power that gives states the powers to make more regulations. I think more regulations are just going to befuddle investors all the more, drive up the cost of investment, and have different rules playing around that are not all coordinated in a market that really is interconnected. So I'm saying we need to find policies at national or subnational levels that attract competition rather than just it being essentially a devolution of power issue. Listen, I don't want the federal government to make these regulations. I want to make them myself. Let every state go and make their own regulations. I think that will, in fact, create more problems in the industry. So do we need to break up? I mean, and when the Honorable Commissioner was talking about the federal government being a problem, let's be clear, it is TCN, really, that we are talking about here, because they are still the only industry player that, quote unquote, is enjoying a national monopoly, right? So does it need to be broken up? Yes, in some form, right? The penalties he's talking about is the fact that really TCN is in a position where it does not pay for its own inability to meet its obligations, and that's correct. So that the solution really is competition, not regulations. So I think it's not reassuring if we say that the idea of all of the states making their own regulations will in fact be good. I think we need to think more clearly about that. Thank you.
So if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to come back to you, Chibuike, with this next question, I don't think yourself and the Honorable Commissioner disagree on the issue of competition, right? And I suspect if we ask the Honorable Commissioner, he probably doesn't even disagree with you that more regulation could also be an issue or a problem, right? So my question to you is, isolating Lagos State for a second, right? And accepting the premise that Lagos State may be able to actually be self-sufficient in terms of power generation and distribution at the 3311 level, and basically be semi-autonomous in that way, right? What becomes of those other states that cannot make the same claim that they can be self-sufficient in power generation? What becomes of that competition when you have such a scarce resource, right? If each of the states is sort of, devolved into, you handle your business primarily your way.
So it's not an entirely strange concept, really. You've got that already in the United States, where some states are really on their own and some other states are a bit in a more collaborative relationship. So I don't see a big risk. For instance, if Lagos is off the market and other states who are perhaps not as equipped as Lagos State is right now continue to depend on what we know as the national grid or some other common infrastructure for wheeling power to themselves. So I really don't see a risk in that regard. The thing though is, as of today, Lagos will have to still depend on at least outside of the states for its own generation. And I've heard the commission talk about the 8,000 megawatts of diesel capacity that they've built over the past few years, and that's true. How long it will take for them to deal with that generation part of what they intend to do is known to the state, and I'm sure they are doing a fantastic work in working all of that out. But I don't see that there is necessarily a big risk if other states are able to continue to relate among themselves if Lagos is not there. Not really, no.
Okay. And I think this will be the last question before we'll field questions from the audience and those online, but to the Honorable Commissioner. So is Lagos State contemplating, setting up a regional infrastructure in the sense of having perhaps a regional ISO with some of its neighboring states as opposed to going it alone? And is that a possibility once you dialogue with some of your neighboring states? Do you see that as a potential outcome?
Question. The hallmarks of this administration is collaboration. We don't have a problem collaborating with neighboring states. We clearly don't. We would be happy to have a regional system if that regional system can better assist in serving our market, specifically the Lagos market. if you will. One is to start an ISO for Lagos, within Lagos, showcase that to the neighboring states, and see if they want to participate in an expansion of such. One area I very clearly agree with the other panelists is in the neighborhood of sectionalizing the transmission company of Nigeria. One of the things that we'll be doing, right, is talking to them about separating the transmission grid in Lagos from the national grid, such that we have points of injection, identify what those trading points are, because that helps us with both preventing any inefficiencies in the national grid from affecting Lagos, as well as helping us identify how we can invest or how we can attract investment into strengthening the transmission sector in Lagos as Lagos State. For example, if we start to have frequency variations in other parts of the grid, we have to have a system where it does not into the electricity market. So for us, it's we're very happy to with everyone. And again, like the other speaker said, TCN is really just another player in the sector. They're not the only problem, if you will. The market settlement system is also another problem. Hopefully they're going to, that's also going to be resolved. But again, I think the biggest part of it is the price fixing part of it. The propensity to say, here's the price of electricity and we don't want to be affected. We don't want to talk about it when elections come up, so that it does not then, which the National Electricity Regulator has done at this one occasion and has created and has sent jitters down the spine of the investors, if you will.
Thank you. So I think we'll open up the questions to the floor. I'm sure there's a microphone somewhere. Any questions from the audience? Any questions from the audience? So there are a couple of questions from the online audience. I will read these. So the first one is, how would a decentralized market for electricity in Lagos accommodate distributed energy systems? If individuals install generation systems, for example, solar PV, and wish to sell surplus power, what provisions would be available in the new Lagos market? And this is from Engineer Chuk. So while we wait on the Honorable Commissioner, so the second question is, since the privatization of energy sector.
Lost you for a bit, it went quiet. So if you ask the question, I did not hear it at all.
Okay, so you're asking me to ask the question again?
Yes, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
So how would a decentralized market for electricity in Lagos accommodate distributed energy systems? If individuals install generation systems, for example, solar PV, and I think in this sense, like rooftop solar, and wish to sell surplus power, what provisions would be available in the new Lagos market? So I correct myself. I don't think that's just limited to like rooftop solar. I think it's having autonomous generation. So how would those distributed electricity systems work in the Lagos electricity market?
Okay, it's really, that's a good question. It's a cost issue, really. So the question would be, if I'm generating power and I want to sell power, the excess power to the grid, will I be able to sell? The answer is yes, if you can meet the cost of the cost of the input price of the grid. Because if I have Lagos network and there are power demands that are not being met, and there are private providers that can competitively supply that into the market. If you recall, when I started, I talked about the 10 largest generators in Ikeja being able to fulfill the requirements of Ikeja as a whole. But regulation today does not allow them to even inject power into the grid. because there are hurdles that they must cross. For example, for you to be able to sell power to the grid, you need to go and get a distribution license. The NERC today is not inclined to give concurrent distribution licenses, meaning if distribution licensee in that area does not consent, then you cannot sell power in that neighborhood. We're going to get rid of all of that. It doesn't make any sense. If there is no power supply and you're able to supply power at a price that the grid can afford, you will be taking. So that's the short answer to that question.
Thank you. So I think the next question is also for you. And it's, since the privatization of the energy sector in Lagos, how many energy suppliers do we have in Lagos? And I'll read a second question also. How many energy sources do we have in Nigeria? What is Lagos plans towards having other energy sources apart from the national power source in Nigeria, which is from Kainji Dam?
Okay, so the first question, how many power sources do we have in Lagos, or how many power suppliers do we have in Lagos? Everybody who has a generator in his own house is supplying power to himself. So if we're looking at it from that point of view, I don't know the number because there's no requirement for generators to report today. If the question is the people who are supplying to multiple people and are exporting power, there's also a lot of that going on. For example, if I have a generator and I'm supplying everybody in my estate power, that's a source of power. I don't know the number, again, because they're not required to provide their data to me as off-grid players or even as captive players. They're not even required to report to any. I don't know in generators through the ports and have it through customs. It's around 8,000, and it's by our porters who are then on selling. So we don't know how many people are actually generating power for use. There's power coming from the grid. There's power coming from a whole number of solar players. Renewables today applying. So there'll be a requirement for reporting when we start to be able to report properly. So when you look at the reports of power supply in Nigeria today, especially on websites where they report them, it's underreported because all they talk about is power that's from the grid. However, when you look at power supplies in Europe, when they're calculating how much power they're generating, they're counting the grid power, the off-grid power as well. Everybody who has a solar rooftop panel installed is counted as people who are providing power into the network or who are supplying it. So in Nigeria, we don't have any such thing. We just look at the power from the grid and say Lagos is getting 13 watts per person, when in fact we are not. We're getting a lot more than that, but it's just terribly expensive. The question is, I'm not sure I heard the third one. What was the third one? Please remind me again.
There were two questions, and I think I perhaps was just repeating the question so that you could hear it audibly. But there were just the two questions. So I can go on to the third question, or a separate question. Establishing Lagos power plants is the easiest to tackle of the value chain. My main concern is distribution systems and the presence of feeders from the national grid. Has someone given serious thought to all likely technical issues? And this is from Dr. Ali.
Okay, so the answer to that is yes. One, we had gone and had developed an integrated resource plan. It's really just looking at the power supply to Lagos, trying to identify what the demand forecast is from the existing load centers in all of the feeders in Lagos, determine what the growth expectation is given the economic trajectory of Lagos State government, and determining what the existing infrastructure gap is in the distribution side, and what the future infrastructure gap will be if the economy grows and the demand grows as we expect it to grow, and then determine what the investment in infrastructure is expected to be. So all of that work has been done. And we've also looked at the transmission forecast, working with the TCN as well, to determine what the transmission infrastructure gap is today and what the transmission infrastructure gap is going to be in the future. We've looked at that as well. And then talking about generation was the last part we looked at, because at the end of the day, generation is meant to serve a market. It does not exist by itself. So let's start from where the market is and where the demand is, determine what is needed to meet that demand. If it's distribution expansion, that's the first thing we'll look at. Then look at the transmission as it exists, the need to go into the distribution market from the transmission sector, determine what the transmission infrastructure gap is, and then lastly, look at generation. If we're able to get all the generation we need through the transmission, then that's it. If there is a significant requirement for additional generation, we've identified where the injection points would be for that additional generation, and also looked at the infrastructure that's needed to pull generation into the grid. So we didn't look at generation as a be-all and end-all. Generation is actually the simplest part of the puzzle, in that it's just the issues are determining what the feeder lengths are, how many LTABC cables you need to replace or install, and then determine what is needed in terms of power injection into this. We have looked at it.
Thank you. So the last question I have, again, directed at you, the Honorable Commissioner, is if the envisaged Lagos grid would have a tie-in to the network grid, what about managing network disturbances? And I guess that's, dealing with issues of imbalances, frequency control, voltage control, issues like that. Now, you made the point earlier that Lagos would be interconnected, but for sake of the question, perhaps you can repeat that emphasis.
Oh, yes, thank you. So if you recall, I talked about an independent system operator. Now, the system operator is not going to be a state government agency that will be controlled by the state. It will be a mutualized agency. It will be an agency that will be set up by the government for the industry and owned and run by the industry, meaning everybody who is a participant in the industry will be a stakeholder in the independent systems operator, which is not the way it is today at the center. That way, everybody has a joint ownership of the system. They will still be regulated, but there will be no board of directors appointed by the state government. There will be no oversight by the state government, really. It will just be the system trying to work as efficiently as possible to ensure that all of their systems are protected. Now, remember that the investment in the network is what is at stake here if we have imbalances in the sector. And so that's even the TCN portion of TCN that is in Lagos will also be a part of that independent systems operator, because its job is really to monitor what's going on in the network and ensure that there are no imbalances in the network, and to ensure that all the players abide to the rules of the game. They're all participants, they develop the code together, and they abide by the codes of the network that we've set up in Lagos. And the reason why we want to have those detection points is such that we can provide the protection that's needed to ensure that any imbalances from the national grid do not come in to upset the state market grid. I think I tried to explain that before, but I hope I've expressed that again today now.
Excellent point. Thank you for clarifying that. I will come back and ask if there are any questions in the audience, but for you, Chubike, I wanted to ask, now that he has clarified the composition of the ISO, and it's basically the parties regulating themselves, does your issue about over-regulation become less of a concern now that he has clarified the composition of the ISO, whether it be at the state or at a regional level?
So, first of all, the clarification does explain a lot, and that's very good. And again, like you rightly pointed out, the issue is not to say that what Lagos is doing is not the right thing. The idea generally is good. It's just to refine some of the details that need to be worked out in all of those things. And I think as the ISO, as they have conceptualized it, will be set up. It's not necessarily so different from what it was always meant to be, even at the national level anyway. It's meant to be a essentially not a commercial entity, and co-owned, jointly owned by all of the operators in the market to make sure that its activities are not driven by any narrower interest. So it's more for the general benefit. And so that's fine, totally at that Lagos level. Again, on the point about removing subsidies, that's also something that we entirely agreed on. The part of the mistakes we've been making, and it's not just in the electricity sector in Nigeria, is that we have been subsidizing consumption rather than production, really. And subsidizing production doesn't mean putting money in the pocket of investors or producers. No, it's just creating the right laws and an environment that enables investors to invest and get their money back. So that point fully, we agreed. And of course, the idea that TCN to some extent needs to be broken up is something that most industry players will not necessarily be opposed to. So the point though remains that even with the ISO as he has conceived it, it will still need, to my mind, a wider collaboration beyond just Lagos State. Again, considering that the consumer markets that will be mostly useful commercially to this setup, which are the large industries, may in fact be in the neighboring states of Lagos State rather than strictly just in Lagos State. So that there just needs to be a bit more collaboration among the states who are at that regional level. And I'll rather have an ISO at a regional level, really, than what the state is having, which is a more narrower boundaries.
Thank you for that rebuttal. So any questions from the audience? If there are no questions, perhaps we can go into closing remarks. And if we do that, that would put us spot on time. So perhaps, Chubuke, I can ask you to give your closing remarks.
So there are a lot of very fantastic ideas in what Lagos has designed that I think others actors at whatever level should pay attention to. The concept of the integrated resource plan, for instance, is a fantastic one. We have had perhaps too much discordance in the industry, where you have investments being thrown at areas where they are not required, or generally a haphazard approach to allocating some of the resources in the industry. So that idea of an IRP is a fantastic one that I think will be useful even just beyond the Lagos State market. The plans on renewable energy, obviously, I think that will place Lagos as a very prime target for financing, with the global trend now towards renewable energies. And I know most investors are now making it a policy to completely avoid getting into any fossil fuel projects at this moment, which over time is going to make it increasingly more difficult and perhaps more expensive to raise capital for some of those projects. So there are elements of the Lagos market policy that are frankly very fantastic. What I would hope is that there will be a more regional approach to those issues. I think those will better address some of those inefficiencies rather than just have an islanded market. That's what I like to call it from a Lagos State perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honorable Commissioner, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Bumi. I think it's been interesting to hear some of the comments and some of the things that we need to think about. We've been at this for the past 2.5 years, so we've had a lot of engagement. So if I seem to have more information than others, it's not because I'm smarter, it's just because I've been discussing this for a very long time. I've also been in the industry for more than 20 years, so I've seen my share of the issues. I've complained significantly about a lot of things that have gone wrong. So it's not it's easy for me to take and a solution that works for Lagos. Tension is not with collaborate to solve the problems that we see. Lagos happens to be in a unique situation that we're not sharing discourse as much as the other states. I think the minimum number of states that the other discourse cover, apart from Lagos, is about 4 states, and in one case, at least 5 states that are covered. So if each state were to were to come up with their own regulation, the DISCOs may have to incorporate or reincorporate their companies to abide by the regulations in at least 4 states, with the exception of Lagos, which has 2 DISCOs that are primarily dedicated to it. So it's not to say that the template for Lagos will fit everyone else. But then again, there's nothing that says that it can't. We don't know how the market will shake out eventually, but at the end of the day, sure, versatile for us just means all the electricity that you want in the quantity and the quality that you want and when you want it. If we can assure that, I think we would have taken a step in the right direction. There are too many issues that are bedeviling the people of Nigeria today, and the lack of electricity is one we think if we can fix would go a long way to reassure people and make them a bit more confident in the system that they existed. So thank you very much. I look forward to engaging more with this with everybody and anybody that's interested in asking questions. And if there are any questions the organization wants to ask, I will be able to address them to your satisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Commissioner. And just before we wrap up, I think I will just give a few closing comments. I think we have this evening heard that Lagos State finds itself in a unique position. Lagos State is trying to solve the challenges that it's facing because of lack of electricity or energy. We know that Lagos State is the economic center of Nigeria, and electricity basically drives industrialization, drives the economy of Lagos. So Lagos is looking for a solution to solve its energy market. Lagos may already be self-sufficient, but it is certainly driving in the direction that it could be self-sufficient. At the same time, not walking away from the fact that it will remain interconnected to the grid, and it will work with, the wider or broader regulations that are at the federal level. I think there were some concerns that what we have seen happen in the National Assembly is more about a devolution of powers that could lead to overregulation and not necessarily about fostering or engendering the market and allowing the market to work. I think that will play itself out over the coming months as that moves, I guess, to the states, and we'll see if it finally gets assented to by the president. So I think that brings us to the end of tonight's event, and I would like to thank everybody both here physically as well as those online for joining tonight's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very much. I want to thank our panelists today. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I know this is a conversation that everyone is interested in. This is one of the few dialogues I've attended over my time organizing this where I've not seen too many questions, and I think it's much more because we are much more interested in this Lagos experiment, and we all want to know how it will turn up. So we're not necessarily questioning it. We're just watching, and we're hoping it turns out okay, given the recent events in the power sector over the past couple of weeks. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you for always engaging us, and I also want to thank you for always coming out when we host this event. We do this not because we like talking about the power sector, because a couple of people have said, oh, you always talk about these issues and there's no change at the end of the day. But we believe these conversations are pertinent, and having them is the first step in solving the issues in the power sector. So once again, thank you very much for being here, and please have a wonderful night.